Hello and welcome to my video all about how to repair clothing using the reverse appliqué method. This is the first in a series of videos I'm going to be doing on clothing repairs, and I'll be covering how to repair rips, worn out areas and also holes in t-shirts, plus much more. So for the reverse appliqué method, what are you going to need? Well, first you're obviously going to need a piece of clothing to repair. This method is good for fixing holes or small stains in a variety of clothes. You don't have to do this repair on trousers like I'm going to do today. You could do it on t-shirts or various other clothing items. You're going to need a small piece of fabric that matches the fabric type that your clothing is made from. For instance, I'm going to be doing my repair on some woven cotton trousers, so I'm going to need a small piece of woven cotton fabric. You're also going to need some thread to match the clothing fabric, so I'm going to be using some cotton thread. I've made the decision to make a decorative repair, i.e. I want the repair to be seen. It's going to be an embellishment on the trousers. Therefore, I'm going to be using some patterned fabric, and I'm also going to be using a fairly thick sewing thread that's in a contrasting colour. On the other hand, if you want the repair to be a lot more subtle, you'll need to choose a fabric that matches the look of the clothing you're repairing. And you'll also need a sewing thread that's the same colour as well. So for instance, if you're repairing some black woven cotton trousers, you would need some black woven cotton material, plus some black sewing thread. The sewing thread can be as thin or as fine as you want it to be, just make sure that it's strong. Regular sewing thread or embroidery floss are options, but I'm going to be using sashiko thread, which is a Japanese thread that's fairly thick. I used a sashiko needle to match my sashiko thread, but in hindsight it was rather a chunky needle, particularly because the trouser material is quite sturdy. I ended up having to use some pliers to pull the needle through the material. In hindsight, I should have used a narrower needle that was sharp, such as an embroidery needle. Some other things you're going to need include some scissors, a piece of paper and a pencil, an iron and an ironing board, some liquid seam sealant such as fray check, although this is optional, a water-soluble or disappearing fabric pen or pencil, or a chalk marker, and some fusible web. Fusible web is quite cheap and it's useful for all sorts of clothing repairs, so I definitely recommend it. You'll need to make sure that it's iron-on fusible web, which means that an iron will melt it between two pieces of fabric to join those fabrics together. Okay, so now we can get started. As you can see, I'm using a pair of trousers for this demonstration that have paint stains all over. They also have a massive rip in the knee, so they are destined for the bin, but I thought I'd use them for this demonstration. I'm going to be using reverse appliqué to get rid of a stain, in this case a drip of paint. The first thing you need to do is draw out a shape on a piece of paper, and this will be your paper template. This paper shape has to be bigger than the hole or the stain that you're trying to get rid of. I personally chose to use an octagon shape, but you can use a triangle, a diamond, a circle, it doesn't matter. Once you've done that, draw around the paper template onto the clothing. Because I'm working on a dark coloured piece of clothing, I used a white water-soluble pencil. You could use a chalk marker instead, or a disappearing fabric pen. Next, use some scissors to carefully cut out this shape. Then take the fabric that you've chosen to use for this repair and cut a piece that's bigger than the hole by about 1 centimetre at least on all sides. You then need to turn the clothing inside out. Cut out a piece of fusible web that's the same size as this fabric. You need this piece of fusible web to be slightly smaller than the piece of fabric. So now you need to trim all the edges of the fusible web by about 1 or 2 millimeters. We then need to trace the shape of the hole onto the center of the fusible web. Then carefully cut this shape out. What you'll be left with is a piece of fusible web with a window in the centre that's the same size as the hole in the clothing. You need to make sure that none of the fusible web will be visible from the front of the clothing. So you may need to make the hole in the fusible web slightly bigger than the hole in the clothing. So at this point you can trim around the hole in the fusible web. Next, we need to go over to the ironing board. Usually when people are working with fusible web, they set the iron to the wool setting, i.e. low heat. However, I often use a higher heat depending on the type of clothing I'm repairing. So in this case, because I know cotton can take a higher heat, I'm going to be using a medium heat setting. Just make sure that whatever heat setting that you use is completely appropriate for the clothing you're repairing. And also make sure that you don't use steam. Okay, so to do this you need to lay the clothing flat and inside out. Place the fusible web so that the window in the web is completely surrounding the hole in the clothing. Next, carefully place the piece of fabric over the top of the fusible web so that you can no longer see any of the web. This piece of fabric needs to be placed right side down. Then press this sandwich of fabric in place using an iron for about 10 seconds. Leave the fabric for a few seconds to cool down and then just check to see that the fabric has stuck to the clothing. You will know when it's done because the fusible web will have melted and glued that fabric patch onto your clothing. And then it's time to turn the clothing right side out and get on with the sewing. I'm going to be hand sewing a running stitch, and this is going to be for decorative purposes as well as to reinforce the fabric patch. As I mentioned before, I'm going to be using a sashiko thread and needle. I also added some fray check along the fabric edges, and this was to try and prevent the fabric edges from fraying. However, I didn't realise that the fray check would permanently make the trouser fabric darker. If I had have known that, I probably wouldn't have used it, so this is definitely an optional step. If you do want to use it, make sure you test it first on an inconspicuous part of the clothing to see how it reacts. Right, so to start sewing, I took a length of sashiko thread and fed it through my needle. I usually just use a piece of thread that's the same length as my arm, because then it's not so long that it will tangle easily. I also put a knot in the end of the thread. Throughout this step, you'll also have to make sure that you don't sew through the back of the clothing as well. To do this, I roll up the trouser leg to allow me to easily put my hand into the trouser leg and have it behind the fabric patch. That way I can feel where the needle and thread goes and make sure it doesn't go through the back of the leg. To start sewing, I take my needle from the inside to the outside of the trouser leg, a short distance away from the hole in the trousers. I then move 1 stitch length along the fabric edge and go back through the trouser leg from front to back. This creates one very simple running stitch. Then on the back of the trouser leg, just to make the start of the thread more secure, I'm going to go in and out of the fabric patch by doing a very small stitch. Then I pull the thread until there's just a small loop remaining and take the needle through that loop. I went once through this loop before pulling it tight. Then you can do it one more time if you like. This is the method I use to begin and end my sewing. You're then ready to do your next running stitch. So go through the trousers from back to front to come out approximately 1 stitch length from the last stitch. Then go from front to back through the trouser fabric and come up again from back to front 1 stitch length away. To make it look neat, try and make all of the stitches the same length and try and make them all the same distance away from each other. The length of the stitch is completely up to you, bearing in mind that the shorter the stitch, the stronger it will be, and the less likely that it will catch on anything. Depending on where this reverse applique is in your clothing, it's unlikely that the stitches will need to be that strong. So I just carry on to do one ring of stitches, and then I do another ring around the outside of that. Once I've finished, I take the needle from front to back through the fabric, and then I do a small stitch into the back of the fabric patch, pull the thread until there's just a small loop remaining, go through that loop and pull tight. And then I repeat that to make it even more secure before cutting off the excess thread. And that's it, that's my reverse applique repair completed. I really hope you found this video useful, and thank you very much for watching.